Good morning again. It's 10:31, so I think we can start right on time. Thank you very much to everyone who has joined us already, and welcome to this webinar jointly organized by Carbon Market Watch and Transport and Environment. We're going to focus on the aviation sector and its climate impact, and more specifically look at the way the EU regulates the aviation sector's climate impacts and all the different policy files that are currently on the table. We know it's quite a busy period for stakeholders who have been following this topic. There are a lot of different discussions ongoing. We're going to try to cover all of them, or as many as we can, and we have structured this webinar in 3 different sessions to cover these different topics. So you can see here the structure of the webinar. We will have a first session on carbon pricing for the aviation sector in Europe. So we will talk about the EU ETS, the emissions trading system, and CORSIA, which is the UN offsetting mechanism for aviation. Then we will go to the second session, talk about sustainable aviation fuels, and discuss whether sustainable fuels can be the solution to aviation's climate problems. And then we'll close with the third session to talk about the non-CO2 impacts of the aviation sector. For each session, we will have a Q&A session. So we invite you to send your questions through the Q&A function of Zoom. You can find at the bottom of the Zoom application, so at the bottom of your screen, if you're in full screen, there should be a box that says Q&A, and if you click on that, you can send us directly your questions. So please use that rather than the chat box. It will help us make sure the event runs smoothly. Finally, a last housekeeping note is that this webinar is being recorded, so you will be able to find the recording on our websites from Carbon Market Watch and Transport and Environment. We're also live streaming this on Facebook, so there will be different channels through which you can find the recordings afterwards. And I think it will be uploaded very quickly after this webinar ends. So that's it for the short housekeeping notice. So we can dive right into the topic. First, I wanted to just give you share a quick note on the context. As I just mentioned, the context is that of a very packed political and policy agenda with many different files on the table. So we have different policies with direct relevance for the aviation sector, which are being discussed, either revisions of existing policies or the implementation of new packages. This includes the review of the rules for the aviation emissions trading system and the implementation of CORSIA, as well as the review of the energy taxation directive and the Refuel EU package, which is expected early next year. In addition to this, there are also several files which are not directly relevant to the aviation sector, but which indirectly have an impact. That includes the review of the non-financial reporting directive, the broader ETS review. So of course we know that the ETS doesn't cover only aviation, but also other sectors. And so revisions of the rules for the whole of the ETS will also impact the aviation sector. And we also expect a review of the Renewable Energy Directive in the first half of next year. So there are many things to discuss. So I'm not going to talk any longer, and I'm not going to go into details on these policies since that's going to be the focus of the different sessions. So to kick us off, we have Stefan Gössling with us. Stefan is a researcher at Lund University. He's been researching aviation and tourism for a long time and has published several very interesting papers. Perhaps some of you have seen articles in The Guardian and other media outlets that summarized some of his findings, which were very interesting. So Stefan will give us a presentation to kind of set the scene about the aviation sector, and which will serve as an introduction for the rest of the webinar before we go into more detailed policy discussions. So I will stop my screen share now, and Stefan, if you'd like to share your screen, please go ahead, and the virtual floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Obviously, I'll have just 10 minutes to provide you with a bit of an academic view of the problem that we have and its solutions, potential solutions. I tend to view the COVID-19 pandemic as an opportunity at this point, and I hope that I can convince you to also see it this way. To start with, we had a number of problems with aviation prior to the COVID-19 crisis. We know that the sector was economically unstable. This is indicated in this graph that you see on the right-hand side. Net profit per departing passenger has been negative for most of the years indicated here, and declining for the last 5 years, then hit the crisis. So the sector has been relying on subsidies and also state aid that has been forwarded at a very significant scale at this point to airlines and other actors in the aviation sector. I think as a result, we've seen a lot of problems related to overcapacities and low profit margins that then have fueled the growth rates of 6 to 7% that we have seen in the last years. On a note, there's no credible strategy to reduce emissions. I'll come back to Kachi in a minute. And more importantly, perhaps we have no strategy to replace fossil fuels or contemporary propulsion technology. There's a bit more complexity here that I want to discuss. Some recent findings probably are of importance when we talk about the relevance and use of aviation. Just 11% of humanity flew in 2018. So when we talk aviation, we really talk about an elite activity, as only 4% flew internationally. And in terms of emissions, because of skewed distributions and flight activity, we estimate that just 1% of humanity is responsible for 50% of emissions from commercial air transport. And then also
sorry to interrupt you. Would you be able to maybe share the slide in full screen? Do you think it's possible?
Oh, sure. Hang on. Coming up like this?
Yeah, that's better. I think.
Right, sorry about this. So we have to talk a little bit about the distribution of emissions, because that is a very significant part of the problem. I've added here a graph or a map rather that shows Mark Zuckerberg's flight patterns in 2017. Private flight obviously is an issue that is mostly ignored, and that also needs to be considered. Other relevant findings from recent research, premium class flights are 2.6 to 4.3 times as carbon intense as economy class. The ICCT just published this. Very important when we talk about emission reductions at the same scale as the frequent flyers. We have other recent research that suggests that non-CO2 effects are in the order of 3 times CO2 if we compare on the basis of net effective radiative forcing. And that obviously sheds new light on the carbon intensity or the warming contributions that aviation is making to global warming. And then ignored by most, we also have had a very significant real cost decline in air transport cost by 60% over the last 20 years. It's becoming cheaper and cheaper to fly, which obviously has pushed demand. So is then ICAO's CORSIA scheme adequate to address this problem? I think from a scientific point of view, everybody working with aviation policy is in agreement that it's inadequate for very different reasons. Some of them are outlined here. I'm not going into detail, but we have no coverage of non-CO2. This is a topic of today's event. The whole thing is voluntary. There's a focus on offsetting through forest projects. All of these issues are just not credible and not reliable in bringing the emissions down. We have some other issues that I would perhaps shortly want to raise, barriers to progress. First of all, the myths, there are many. Some I want to tackle here. Poor families cannot fly anymore. That's one I hear surprisingly often. Well, what our research has shown is that poor families don't fly in the first place. And then also, I think we're all in agreement that our economic system is capitalism, and that just means not everybody is entitled to the same things. Technology will resolve the problem is another myth that we have addressed in different publications. In one, we have looked into the different propositions of technologies that will resolve the problem. There have been no less than 15 different ones over the past 25 years proposed by industry. At the same time, emissions have doubled. So I'm a bit more skeptical when I look into new proposals, also because there's a lot of issues related to these proposals that will make them very difficult to actually come through and actually resolve the problem. I think that the major problem with the narrative of technology is, though, that people have had an idea that whatever they do doesn't matter, somebody else will resolve it. We have other barriers to progress. I call them needs and wants. There's usually a discourse that everybody needs to fly. I think we need to change that into something different. We always, or more often, want to fly. And there's different reasons for this on different levels. I've just outlined a few here. Again, I can't talk about all of them in detail, but I think it's very important to note here at this point that much air travel is induced. That's firmly established in the literature. We've shown this in different ways. If you slashed or slimmed the aviation sector by a significant margin, people probably wouldn't even feel it because, as Bannister in the UK said, it's not more people flying because of cheap prices, it's the same people flying more. This all brought us to engage in a rather large project recently. We looked into the different policies that we potentially have to bring down emissions from aviation. This is under review. It's essentially what you see here, 3 dimensions that I think are very relevant when we talk about emission reductions. And usually we just only talk about technology change. I think there's 2 more dimensions that are relevant. The first is transport demand changes. How do we reduce growth rates or demand for air transport? And then the third one is social norm change. How can we make people agree that something has to be done? And surprisingly, there's a huge level of agreement actually that something should be done. So within this triangle of different options, you have different policies that could be described as being soft policy, market-based, or regulatory. And as you can see, we have distributed them within this triangle of transport demand change, technology change, and social norm change, and also assigned them a level of effectiveness. In other words, how much each of these policies may contribute to reducing emissions. And this gives us a much better sense of what will work and what will not work. Obviously, some of these policies will be very far-reaching, even in terms of acceptance by consumers or citizens. But you always need to be aware that we might not be willing to support policies as consumers, but as citizens, we might very well be. And out of this, I think there's 3 major insights for policies that we would need to implement post-COVID. The COVID crisis, as I said, is essentially an option for restarting the aviation system under different conditions. This is shown in the graph for a policy set that involves both a carbon tax and a feed-in quota for sustainable aviation fuels, in this case, non-biogenic synthetic fuels, as we wanted to know what the best CO2 option would mean in terms of emission reductions over time if you had a feed-in quota of 3% per year until 2050, essentially bringing emissions down to 0. And this is what the graph shows. Essentially, the gray polygon that you have on top is what the business as usual scenario would have been. The red is where we expect the recovery to be if nothing is done. And then the blue greenish area indicates what a feed-in fuel quota with a carbon tax could do in order to bring down emissions. And if anybody thinks the system is down because of this, no, it's not. Actually, in this scenario, the revenue passenger kilometers would still double until 2050 compared to 2019. So what we need is probably, first of all, to remove subsidies to the sector. That is sort of a basic assumption. We need to internalize the CO2 and non-CO2 cost, and we need to transition to new fuels and technologies as three essential pillars for the transition. We also need to address some issues here as outlined in the frequent flyers, and more information on this is actually available in the new World Economic Forum report that is really excellent in terms of summarizing the different options for sustainable aviation fuels. This is sort of a roundup to provide you with some background on where we are standing and where we could move from now onwards if policymakers took the opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan. Very good presentation. Apologies if some of you had difficulties at the beginning to see the slides. Seems like some of us could see them, others couldn't. The joys of online meetings. But hopefully now this works for everyone, so please tell us if it doesn't. Thanks again, Stefan, for this presentation. Yeah, I think it's very interesting the way you talk about different levels and different levers of action. Definitely something to consider also in the coming discussions, since we have so many different topics and policies to regulate the aviation sector. Now, having set the scene, describing some of the issues and some of the context that the sector is facing, we can turn to the solutions. The first session we are going to focus on now is related to carbon pricing. We have with us Kachi from NewClimate Institute. Aki has been following these policies for a long time as well. And he will talk to us about carbon pricing in the EU, how the EU ETS and CORSIA could be implemented, and how this can impact the aviation sector. So, Aki, please go ahead if you'd like to share your screen, hopefully for everyone to see this time.
Can everyone see my screen now?
Yes, I think so. I can see them.
Okay. Great. Yeah, first of all, also thank you on my behalf to Carbon Market Watch and Transport and Environment for hosting this. I'm very happy to present today. I'd like to start, which is a quick reminder that the Paris Agreement says that we should get to well below 2 degrees and make efforts to get to 1.5. That the EU's contribution under UNFCCC with the target year of 2020 includes outgoing flights starting in the EU and with a destination outside of the EU. The EU's NDC commitment is at least 40% by 2030. It's not so clear there to what extent that includes outgoing flights, but if it doesn't include outgoing flights, it's a major reduction in the scope of ambition of the EU's contribution. It's notable that the EU's NDC does not include any contribution from international credits. There are discussions going on right now to increase the level of that ambition to at least 55% by 2030. And the EU has a clear target for climate neutrality by 2050. What does this mean in terms of aviation? Well, aviation accounts for 2 to 3% of global CO2 emissions. That does not include the non-CO2 impacts of that. For the EU, it's about 3.6% of emissions, and those are growing. As we just heard, they could double or triple by 2050, although it's not really entirely clear what the longer term impacts of COVID-19 are going to be. I found it very interesting that Bill Gates recently seems to think that business travel will not recover to the extent that many people maybe hope. The Climate Action Tracker, which is a project of NewClimate Institute and Climate Analytics, recently came out with a rating of international aviation, looking particularly at CORSIA. and found that the climate neutral goal of from 2020 levels is highly insufficient, and is clearly not in line with a 1.5 degree pathway. And that's almost regardless of the impact of COVID. And the gray box here represents what the level of the ambition would have been had we had the original baseline of an average of 2019 and 2020 years, and what we expect the level to be considering the baseline change to only 2019 levels. So regardless, if CORSIA is implemented as expected, it's highly insufficient for reaching the global goals. That's based on a methodology with an assumption that aviation should decarbonize at the same rate as all industrial and energy processes. We can talk about that, but it's clear if aviation does not decarbonize at that same rate, then other sectors in the world have to decarbonize much, much faster. And that's not necessarily a realistic scenario. And also this climate action tracker rating is for CO2 emissions only, but we'll hear more about the non-CO impact later today. So given that the climate neutral goal from 2020 levels, and it's now actually 2019 levels, which are obviously much higher than the average of the 2019 and 2020 levels, that in itself as a target is insufficient for the Paris Agreement. But even those levels are very unlikely to be actually reached, considering there's very limited participation. CORSIA is likely to cover much less than 50% of emissions, of global emissions from 2021 to 2035, especially because it does not cover emissions below the 2019 levels. And also, according to the current list of states that are expected to participate from 2021, there are a lot of states that are missing from that list. We're not sure when they will participate, if they will participate, and that means every flight going in or out of those states will not be covered by CORSIA. So we have very limited participation. We have quite heterogeneous offset unit quality, and you don't need to take my word for that. That's quite clearly laid out in the technical advisory body of ICAO's evaluations of the various offset applications. And I have links later. They go through and they consistently find that multiple programs do not adhere or meet all of the criteria. That most of them have been accepted to supply CORSIA anyway. It's very unlikely that the price of CORSIA compliance units will trigger investments in operation and technical measures. It's much cheaper to buy credits at far below €1 than to invest in energy efficiency, synthetic fuels, or technological advancement. We have a huge oversupply of credits. NewClimate has just come out with some new estimates of CDM potential supply for crediting activities that started after 2016, which is the cutoff date for CORSIA. We estimate, together with the Japanese modeling team, 46 to 63 million credits from the CDM alone, and the CDM is only one of many, many offset standards that have been approved for eligibility under CORSIA. And also, CORSIA eligible fuels may not deliver real and sufficient reductions. It's a little bit hard to tell so far exactly how the criteria for the eligible fuels will actually be implemented and applied, especially considering that we don't actually have any sustainability certification schemes approved at the moment for CORSIA. The applications for various schemes to do that are still under evaluation, so it's a little bit unclear. Bringing this to the EU context, formally aviation, including incoming and outgoing flights into and out of the EU, has been covered by the EU ETS since 2012. It's a capped environment, so there's a clear limit on growth, big comparison to CORSIA. But at the same time, most allowances are allocated for free. Of course, we all know that there was the stop the clock decision in 2012, so that the ETS only applies to flights between EEA or EFTA countries, and that the scope is now set to continue through the end of 2023. And just to give people an idea of what current prices in the EU ETS are, we're about 27, 29 euros a ton. I think it went up from yesterday to today slightly. But considering the ambition increases in the EU ETS and future reform, it's likely that they're not going to be crashing down to the levels of CORSIA. But that obviously depends on a lot of different considerations, the overall linear reduction per year, the future reforms of the market stability reserve that she mentioned, and a number of other factors. The EU put forward 6 options with relation to the EU ETS and CORSIA. One is the ETS full scope to and from the EU or EFTA countries. So basically the way the legislation has foreseen it originally in the 2012 legislative process. EU ETS only for intra-EU EFTA countries, so I assume no CORSIA, although the description of that is a little bit unclear in the impact assessment or the consultation, therefore. CORSIA only, an ETS CORSIA clean cut option, where we kind of keep the same scope for the EU ETS between EU member states and CORSIA in and out of the EU. I'll mention that means that there's a significant ambition reduction from a consideration or a scenario where the ETS is actually applied also at least to outgoing flights. An ETS CORSIA mix with the ETS covering up to 2020 levels and CORSIA for above 2020 levels. That wouldn't provide much of a reduction in growth. And another ETS CORSIA mix according to the license of aircraft operators, which would provide a significant comparative advantage to foreign operators coming in and out of Europe compared to European airlines. And I'm not going to go into a detailed discussion of the price signals that each one of these options would come up with. I think that there's a lot of uncertainty, especially around the ETS. But I think it's fairly clear that the ETS full scope would provide the strongest price signal. And just a quick thought exercise. And although the ICAO carbon calculator is not the same as the ICAO MRV methodology for airlines exactly, it gives us sort of a feeling for things. According to the ICAO calculator, an economy class flight ticket from Paris to New York JFK emits about 654 kilograms of CO2. if we consider the price signal of a CORSIA unit of about €1 a ton, and it's not actually, this is not actually the price that would be paid, because the airline would only pay the additional growth above 2020 levels. So if it doesn't grow from 2020 levels, they don't pay anything. But if they did pay for actually every ton that they emit, the increase in the flight ticket would be about 65 €. Compare that to a current EUEA price of 27 euros. That would be a translation to the flight ticket of about 17 euros and 66 cents. And just, it's not really exactly relevant, but comparison to checking one extra piece of luggage on Delta between Paris and New York, which is about 85 euros, or within the domestic US, it's about $40. We really see that the CORSIA price signal will have very, very little effect on passenger demand behavior, and very, very unlikely any effect on measures undertaken by airlines to reduce emissions. A far larger factor is going to be kerosene jet fuel prices, and as a result of COVID, global oil markets have crashed, and if we think that Elon Musk and electric mobility is going to have a major breakthrough in the next few years, we can expect also oil prices and kerosene jet fuel prices to go down accordingly. So we're not going to have that signal from especially CORSIA for the time being. And I can only second some of the comments made in the last presentation. I think in the short term, we need a price signal that provides a demand management incentive to either not fly or reduce flying, or to shift to lower emitting modes of transport. We need a price signal that clearly provides an incentive for operational measures, a demand signal that clearly provides an incentive for improved aircraft design and to retire old aircraft. We're not going to get that from the fuel prices, although we have had that at certain times in the past. And in the medium term, we need to really chart a path towards electrification of short-haul flights, and scale up of synthetic power to liquid fuels to decarbonize aviation. And just a couple of places where you can look for further information. That climate action tracker assessment from the summer, information on participating states, the supply potential for the CDM that we just brought out, and a couple other links, mostly from ICAO itself. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Aki. Great presentation. Quite striking to see that you can pack a lot of offsets for the price of a checked luggage. So that says a lot about the shortcomings of CORSIA, which I think Mark, Deutsche, and Tierney have been highlighting in the past. I'll pass on directly to Damien Meadows from the European Commission to share some thoughts from the Commission on how this revision is expected to happen, and how they are planning to go ahead with these policies.
Thank you, Gilles, Stefan, and Aki. I'm very glad that attention's being drawn to this, because there's sometimes a notable lack of transparency on what's going on. It's hugely important to make this more transparent. The rest of the European economy is making a big effort to tackle climate change. And I've really got 3 points. I mean, internalizing the carbon dioxide cost, as Stefan said, is absolutely key. I can remember when IATA's consultants, Arthur Anderson, said in 2001, I think, that it was a no-brainer to price carbon from the aviation sector. We need progress here. It's socially progressive to price carbon according to Bruegel, and when we have coal mines closing, when we have major efforts across the economy, it's only fair to expect aviation to contribute. On what Aki said here, Paris is different to Kyoto. Paris says developed countries shall take economy-wide action. It does not defer to the International Civil Aviation Organization. And Europe, at least in our current 40% reduction, I think there are slides around showing that our coverage of aviation for 2020 is maintained in those figures. So you need aviation to contribute along with the rest of the economy. How's Europe been doing this? Well, since 2005, the Commission has wanted to have it possible that aviation be taxed on the same basis as other fuels. With Morocco, we have an air service agreement which is totally open to the taxation of kerosene. The EU mandate, the EU 27 mandate with the United Kingdom for a future partnership says that this agreement shall not continue to exempt aviation fuel from taxation. That's paragraph 67. So, I mean, I won't say that's an early test because we've been going this way since 2005. But if we're serious about pricing carbon in a way that's fair with the rest of the economy, you should keep an eye on taxation and whether we're actually making progress in practice. Emissions trading is seen by some as a sort of second best because it prices carbon, but it's not as high as, say, the level of kerosene taxation there would be compared to road transport. The EU ETS, despite the attacks that it had on it, has delivered around 200 million tons of offsets. That's European Airlines' own figures, only from its intra-European scope. And most importantly, it's ensured equal treatment on routes. So Saudi, even Mr. Donald Trump have been fined under this system and have paid the penalties and complied. Without equal treatment, then neither a tax nor an ETS is possible. In addition, 100% of the aviation auction revenue is used to tackle climate change. My second point, I guess, is these measures alone won't be sufficient. Synthetic fuels, things like this, are very expensive. If you want them to be anything other than greenwashing, you have to get the economics right. And we've got public consultation asking about contracts for difference. If you want to have an airline which bridges the difference between hydrogen-derived fuel and conventional kerosene, a contract for difference could support you for the pioneers doing this. Gilles mentioned the open public consultations. I would urge everyone to respond because without this, well, it won't reflect your input. And we can do this. We have a 12 billion euro fund paid for by the EU ETS, the so-called Innovation Fund. I'm not aware of any airlines or airline manufacturers actually asking for support from this. When I talk to the chemical industry, when I see the steel industry, when I see the power industry, Enel and others, the public positions that they take, it's incredible. We have a fighting chance to avoid catastrophic climate change. But when it comes to the aviation sector, I see some mock-up pictures of a plane that could fly in 15 years. Why are the manufacturers of aviation electric aircraft in the States, in Israel, in Norway, when it comes to shipping? I wish European actors could be doing more here because you are being supported if you do so. My third and final point, I guess, would be for broader global action. I'm involved in the airport carbon accreditation system, and I think this is a very worthwhile bottom-up initiative that delivers something. More than anything, I want the top-down system, well, not more than anything, but I want the top-down ICAO CORSIA scheme to work. But having worked in this area since 1998, there are challenges. The challenges don't come from Europe. The challenges come from the fact we're in a very varied world. Stefan emphasized the differences between countries. Per capita aviation emissions from China are 1/10 those of the United States. We've written about this in a book that's freely available online. I think the factor is a factor of 20 when it comes to India. And China's public position is that it opposes any scheme which is unfair to China. So I understand that the US position may be that it won't implement CORSIA unless China does. Well, I mean, we've got reservations from Russia, we've got reservations from India, we've got reservations from Saudi Arabia. The United States itself would likely have to enact domestic legislation because without domestic implementation, all of this is a mirage. I agree with Aki. I mean, if supply exceeds demand, the price will go to zero. So if EU ETS quality CDM, I understand, is currently 20 eurocents. It's hard to get excited, I guess, in terms of the decarbonisation this would deliver, even without talking about the change in baseline, which potentially means no reductions will come. So Europe wants to make this work. We've actually put in place legislation. Our airlines have monitored their global emissions. I think you can see the Netherlands have already published this. I want to see the figures from the United States. I want to see the figures from Saudi Arabia showing similar levels of transparency. I want to see from the ICAO Secretariat what countries have notified about participation in CORSIA, because Europe has notified that it intends to implement CORSIA subject to the fact we have existing laws and we will change these laws. And this would be my last element, that we have open public consultation right now for people to give their views. The first question is, do you think aviation should do more than it's currently doing? We are planning to propose legislation by June 2021, so in 7 months' time, to implement CORSIA in respect of the European Union. We've already indicated we think we need a strong price signal, we think we need meaningful measures for intra-European flights at least. But for extra-European flights, will Europe be the first region in the world to implement CORSIA in law? Are others following? How do we ensure equal treatment on routes? That's another question in the open public consultation. So all of these, I think we would welcome your views. Also, I think it was very good from Aki to highlight the studies that are available. I mean, we've had a study carried out on CORSIA. We've got a study online on the legal issues. The more we look at this, I think the better we can do. Aviation, this is maybe my last point. Under the ETS today, aviation has a free allocation of around 800, 900 million euros a year. We've studied whether these costs are passed through to customers. We will be making a proposal. There's a real question here. I mean, if airlines wanted zero carbon fuels, why wouldn't airlines be pressing for this money to be used to pay for those fuels? The ETS today gives a 75 euro incentive for biofuels. I don't see this, they're still 1/20th of 1%, but you come onto this. But I would, I guess, be far more encouraged if I saw from the airline community beyond the airports, the actual wish to have policy that got us to where we need to be, because Europe can do it. We're doing it in most sectors of the economy, or going to be trying to do this. And aviation and also shipping have been largely, through their own pressure, left out of the common efforts that are being made. So thank you very much, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks very much, Damien, and thanks to everyone who has sent in questions. Again, please do use the Q&A to send your questions rather than the chat. It will be easier for us to monitor them. We are already quite advanced in terms of time, and I think, so I'm looking at the questions, several of them have been answered by Aki and Damien already. I just want to pick one here for Aki, talking about the coverage of CORSIA. So you mentioned that it covers probably less than 50% of emissions. Someone is asking why is this number different from numbers that IATA, for example, has been discussing. For example, in its latest aviation benefits report, it mentions that CORSIA covers 70 to 80% of international aviation CO2 emissions. So maybe you can just highlight quickly what are the factors that reduce the coverage of CORSIA to understand why it's not as high as that number.
There are two factors there. One is that countries that represent a relatively high share of international emissions are participating in CORSIA. So if we expect the US to participate, which I think is maybe slightly more likely now under a Biden administration, but we'll see about what legislation in the Senate. And the EU participates, so transatlantic flights already represent a huge proportion of international aviation. And so the US and Europe are two of the largest markets and have been up until 2020. But CORSIA will only cover additional growth from actually 2019 levels. 2020 levels are obviously much lower than 2019 levels. And in addition to that, any flight going into or out of those states that are going to or coming from countries that are not participating in CORSIA, so any flight from Europe to China or from the US to China or from the US to Brazil will not be covered, even if the US represents a large proportion of global aviation. So countries that represent a large proportion of global aviation may participate, but it is not that every flight coming in and out of those countries will be covered by CORSIA. And obviously, as I said, it's only the additional growth from 2019 levels, which is a very small percentage of actual global aviation emissions.
Thanks, Kachi. Well, now I see that there are many questions coming in, which is exactly the time when we have to go to the next session, unfortunately. But maybe some of the panelists can also answer through the Q&A function, typing or in the chat if they wish to. Otherwise, I think many of these questions can also be answered with looking at the documents and the impact assessments published by the Commission. And I would again encourage everyone to participate in the consultation and make your views heard, because it sounds from the questions like people do have views on this, and that's great to hear. So I will just pass the moderation to Andrew from Transport and Environment, who will continue leading you through the rest of this webinar. So thanks, everyone.
Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you for the speakers so far this morning who have all made fantastic contributions to this discussion. I'm Andrew Murphy. I'm the Aviation Director at Transport and Environment, and we're co-organising this event with Carbon Market Watch. As Gilles says, we're up against the clock, so I'll hand straight over to our next topic, our next speaker. We're moving now to discuss what are the potential fuel solutions, what are the replacements to kerosene we can find for aircraft currently and planned to be in production over the coming years. And our principal speaker this morning is Jo Howes. She is principal consultant with E4 Tech, a UK-based consultancy where she leads the work on energy policy with a particular interest in biofuels and hydrogen. And without further ado, I will hand over to Jo. Jo?
Hello, and sorry, I'm having a slight technical problem here, so just one second, let me get my slides sorted out. Sorry about this. Andrew, can you see my slides?
We can see the slides, yeah, if you want to just...
I'll get them into full screen, just one second. Is
Great.
that working okay? Wonderful. Yeah. Sorry about that, everybody. So hello, I'm Jo Howes. As Andrew said, I'm from E4 Tech, based in the UK and in Switzerland. And I'm going to be talking about the fuel side of this question. Our perspective is that we're a consulting firm who's been working on sustainable aviation fuels for around 10 years now, but working on a whole range of low carbon transport fuels for over 20. So the first question is, what are sustainable aviation fuels? So what I'm going to be talking about today is a range of different types of fuels which we think are essential to decarbonising the aviation industry. And that includes biofuels, so a whole range of types of renewable fuels that can be made from biomass. It includes fuels that are variously called e-fuels, power to liquids, RFNBOs, which stands for renewable fuels of non-biological origin, but basically fuels made out of electricity. For example, renewable electricity used to make hydrogen and then combined with carbon dioxide, either from the air or from point sources, and combined to make a fuel. And also included within this, I'd put recycled carbon fuels. So that's fuels that could be derived from recycled carbon-containing gases or solid fossil wastes. I should also say that under CORSIA, there's also an interest in something that they call lower carbon aviation fuels, which is fossil fuels with lower carbon emissions than fossil fuels normally have, but I won't be focusing on those today. Now, I'm not going to talk through this slide or many of the slides I have that are very detailed, but this is just to say that even within one of those categories, within biofuels alone, there are a whole range of different types of options. They start with different types of feedstocks, be it crops, which is what most biofuels are made from today, or waste oils like used cooking oil, but also encompass a whole range of other types of feedstock. So for example, woody residues, agricultural residues, municipal solid wastes, and even things that are at a much earlier stage of development, like algae that could produce oils. Each of those feedstocks can be processed in multiple different ways to get to a fuel. And the diagram I've shown here shows different ways that you could get them to a jet fuel, but there are plenty of other products that can be made as well. So fuels for road transport and also feedstocks for the chemicals and materials industry, who also have strong decarbonisation pressure at the moment. So there are a whole variety of different routes, which are at various stages of commercial development today. But many of them can get to a fuel that can be blended with fossil jet at up to 50% certified at the moment. Now, the important thing to say is that all of these pathways or fuel chains are very different. They, as I said, they're at different stages of commercialization. They have very different costs. They have different sustainability characteristics, both in terms of their life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, but also in terms of other sustainability impacts they might have. Their supply chains are, in some cases, parts of them are established, in some places they're nascent. They're very different structures of supply chains. They have very different resource potentials. So the amount of those feedstocks that I showed on the left-hand side can vary considerably depending on which one you're talking about. And each of those feedstocks and each of those products that comes out has a variety of different end uses and potentially competing end uses, potentially complementary end uses. The important thing is to recognize these when making policy, because sometimes it's not as straightforward as picking on one or even two of these things. It's not as straightforward as saying what's the cheapest way to do this or what's the sustainable way to do this. Some of these things are a minimum criterion, needs to save greenhouse gas emissions, and some of them we have to work out how to deal with through the policy mechanism that's put in place. Now, of all the routes that I've talked about to get fuels, some of them are certified through the ASTM process to be suitable to be put up to, into jet fuel at up to a certain blend level, and some of them are still in the process. The most mature route within all of this is called HEFA, and I'm afraid this is an area where there are a ridiculous number of acronyms that also change every couple of years on the acronyms that are in vogue at the time. So I'm trying to use as few of these as possible in this presentation. But HEFA is fuel that's made through using oils, which could be waste oils, for example, which are hydroprocessed to produce a fuel that can be put into planes. And that is the route that has been used in the majority of biofuel flights to date. And it's very similar to a process that's used to make renewable diesel for road transport. So that's the one where there's been the biggest production volume so far. It's a commercial technology and there's the most experience in doing it, and the biggest number of plans for plants to come online over the next few years. But there are two other routes that are at a slightly earlier stage. A Fischer-Tropsch route, so this is a route which could take wastes or take wood and gasify those and turn them into a fuel. That's written as FT-SPK on there, where there are several plants in development at a demo scale and plans for commercial scale plants. Also another route called ATJ, or alcohol to jet, where ethanol, for example, that is currently produced as a fuel and a chemical from biomass, could be converted into jet fuel through a secondary process. So those are two other routes that could be introduced at a larger scale in the next 5 years. There are also a set of technologies that are at a much earlier stage. Their developments at a much earlier stage, and their progress through this certification is at a much earlier stage. Now, the important thing about all of them is that they're all more expensive than fossil jet. And importantly, they're all expected to remain more expensive than fossil jet. Now, I'm not saying that their costs can't come down, but I've shown a graph here that's from a report by McKinsey for WEF, but we've done these studies in a huge amount of detail for these different routes internally, and every study I've seen shows the same things, that they're expected to remain more expensive into the future. Now, they're all more expensive for different reasons, and that's a really important thing. It's not just a question of saying, well, we can build a bigger plant and the costs will come down. They each have different reasons for their high costs, and whilst they can all improve, they're all still expected to be more expensive. HEFA, that route from oils that I talked about, is the lowest cost route today, and can also have very high greenhouse gas savings when waste oils are used. So that's good news for using this fuel in aviation today. The less good news is that's relying on waste oils, and however many chips we eat, then those waste oil feedstocks are going to be limited. So we need those other routes that start from feedstocks that are much more abundant. So things like wood residues, agricultural residues, potentially woody energy crops, and also the power to liquids routes to be commercialized if we want to get very high deployment and very high greenhouse gas savings in the long term. So the question is, how do we bridge this cost gap? Not only for HEFA, which despite being the cheapest is considerably more expensive still than jet fuel today, but also for these other routes, which we know we need to have to be able to get to those levels of deep decarbonisation. As previous speakers have talked about, CORSIA is not going to be enough. The EU ETS credit price is not going to be enough. The EU Renewable Energy Directive allows member states to give some incentive for renewable fuels in aviation, and in some countries that does enable you to bridge the gap at certain credit prices. So for example, in the Netherlands and also in the UK, some aviation fuels can contribute towards targets and generate a certificate which can help to bridge that gap. However, in most places, that there isn't policy in place which helps to do that. So what's been happening so far is that European countries have been starting to develop their own policies. In some cases, discussion of mandates, in some cases, opt-in to policies that were made for road transport. In some cases, longer term targets and visions, but not yet with the real policy to implement them. But the important thing is that the sum of those targets at the moment still results in a relatively limited market for SAF. Now, it's a huge market compared with the amount of SAF that's produced today, but it's still not very much when we're thinking about what we need to do to decarbonize. So at the moment, there is discussion of this Refuel EU aviation program of what options there could be for having policy at EU level. And there have been consultations on this, there have been industry and stakeholder discussions. But as I understand it, there are still many important questions that need to be resolved. So, for example, if there was a mandate, so a mandate that which some people call a fuel quota, a mandate to blend a certain amount of low carbon fuels or renewable fuels, or however you want to define it. What should the scope of that be? Intra-EEA, intra and extra EEA. Who do you obligate? So in most road transport policies, it's the fuel supplier that's obligated. the oil company, for example, that's supplying the airport, or the airline themselves. We looked at this in quite a lot of detail in a study for the Netherlands government this time last year, and I've put a link on that at the bottom of the slide. And we concluded that we thought that obligating the fuel suppliers would be a much easier way to do this, given that there are a smaller number of them, and that they've actually built up significant expertise in things like assuring the sustainability of fuels, which has taken them 10 years to do since the beginning of fuel policies, for renewable fuel policies in the road transport sector. There are questions still about how you demonstrate compliance with this kind of scheme. Should there be a requirement to physically supply SAF at each airport? Or could you have what's called a book and claim system, where one obligated party can comply by supplying a lot of SAF in one place and none somewhere else? That's generally a more efficient way to do it, because you avoid people having to transport SAF around, when really what you want is a greenhouse gas saving. It doesn't really matter where the greenhouse gas saving is, as long as you haven't double counted it. There are very important questions about interaction with other policies. So, for example, things like the caps on the amount of waste oils used that are under the RED II policy, or the sustainability criteria that are under the RED II policy, which the supply side industry is already working to. So how do those things interact? The metric for the target is also very important. Should this be a certain number of tons supplied, or should this be a certain level of greenhouse gas saving? There are pros and cons on either side of that discussion. The volume-based or mass-based target is much simpler and much easier to set out for different types of fuels. The greenhouse gas-based route drives continuous improvement, but doesn't necessarily recognize some other characteristics of fuels. For example, that some of them have a much bigger resource potential than others. And I'm not going to talk about everything on this slide given the time, but I think the last and really important one on here is the qualifying feedstocks and fuels. Of all those routes that I talked about, which ones are acceptable fuels for aviation? Should crop-based biofuels be allowed? Should waste oil-based biofuels be allowed, and up to what level? How can less commercialized fuels, like ones made from advanced feedstocks, that's the woody feedstocks or waste feedstocks, for example, or e-fuels or recycled carbon fuels be included? If it is a greenhouse gas-based standard, should lower carbon fossil fuels be included? So the important message to take away from this slide is that every single one of these factors interacts with each other. So all of them need to be decided upon at the same time. You can't set a target and then decide later which feedstocks get into it, because the ability to meet that target will be really dependent on which feedstocks you let in. So you've got to think about all of these things at the same time. And if one of them gets changed through negotiation at the last minute, then there's a possible that the whole thing doesn't stack up. So all of those things need to be discussed together. My final slide that I wanted to talk about, though, is the fact that if you put in place a policy which doesn't adequately distinguish between different types of fuels, then you will only get heifer. You will only get that near-term, very good but limited in potential fuel that I was just talking about, based on waste oils, for example. And in projects that we've done, both that one I was talking about for the Netherlands government, but another whole range of projects for public and private clients, including for the DFT and sustainable aviation in the UK, we talked to a whole range of companies about the support that might be needed for advanced biofuels and e-fuels to get them to commercialization. And this rests on three things. The first thing is having a clear long-term policy, and that's not only what is the mandate, but it's a clearer vision of how you get to transport decarbonisation, because many of these things interact. The second one is market and revenue certainty for those advanced fuels through market-based policy. So, subsidizing one or two plants in some way is not enough. To be able to go to an investor or go to a board and say, we want to we want to, approval for a business plan in this direction, there has to be a long-term market, and saying, well, we've got support for one plant is not going to do that. So this is a question about making sure that there is something that gives that visibility. And so, for example, in the road transport sector, this is done through a sub-target for advanced biofuels. In this area, could it be done through a sub-target for advanced biofuels and e-fuels, or both of those separately? The revenue certainty is to do with the value of the fuels under that target. And people have suggested having a floor price, having contracts for difference, and something like that. Now, the reverse is also true, that long-term certainty is needed, and that longer-term market certainty is needed. But that doesn't mean that the support for the first plants is not needed. And it's about building up access to finance for those. So that could be through public support for those plants. That's something we're working with the Department for Transport on in the UK at the moment. And I know there's a lot of discussion in different member states about that. But also working out how to increase private sector investment in this area, especially given the challenges to the private sector that have been seen through COVID-19. That was a very quick go through all of this, and well, very quick from my point of view and probably too long from Andrew's point of view. So I'll stop and please fire away with questions. Thank you.
Thanks, that was a super presentation, and I think also interesting to see how many issues remain outstanding with the Refuel EU initiative, which the Commission will be launching in the first quarter of 2021. But which will also pass through legislation from the Council and from the European Parliament. So big decisions to be made as well by member states and by MEPs as to how this legislation will look like. And I hope we will have a clearer idea this time next year. But yeah, a lot of issues to be resolved. I'm going to hand over now to Henrik from Deutsche Post DHL. Deutsche Post, Henrik is one of the sustainability leads at Deutsche Post DHL and was very much involved in their Go Green Euro 2050 initiative, which he will discuss now. So Henrik, I will hand over to you. Thanks.
Yes, thank you, Andrew. I hope you can hear and see me and see my slides. So first of all, I can say that I can agree with many of the points that Joe just made, which makes it a bit easier for me. So I can maybe jump one or the other aspect. First of all, I guess it might be interesting to know why am I speaking here, and I'm not going to go through all the numbers. In the end, I think one abbreviation that I need to explain to you is TDI, which is Time Definite International. That's the overnight express shipment that we do a lot, which heavily relies on aviation. In addition to that, we also do air freight. And I think it's important here to mention that in the past presentations, mainly we heard aspects about passenger aviation, and that cargo aviation or air freight is, of course, basically using the same technology, but has very different implications to society. And first of all, no one flies cargo for fun. It's something that you do because you seem to have good reasons to do that, because it increases your product's price significantly. And we often see that high value goods are flown around the world rather than transported on ships. Also time-critical goods like spare parts in factories. And of course, in the COVID crisis, we saw the paramount significance for medical equipment, meaning personal protection equipment, as well as vaccines coming in this year, in the coming year, hopefully. But it all comes at a price. We do have a significant carbon footprint as a group. Of about 29 million tons CO2 equivalents, and the majority of that from air transport. As we are also aware of our responsibility towards the society and environment, we did agree on the target to achieve zero emissions by 2050, which we consider in line with the Paris Agreement, and we already committed to this back in 2017. So we were one of the first movers in the logistics industry. Now coming to sustainability in aviation, and I think I don't really have to talked about anything related to the technologies of or types of sustainable aviation fuels, as I would fully agree to everything that Joe said on that behalf. Then on the right-hand side here, you see some considerations on the regulatory environment that we see might accelerate the uptake of sustainable aviation fuels, where in general I also agree with the things that Joe brought up, but I have some additions. So what would be very helpful is, of course, to have an opt-in for the different SAF types in Europe in the national implementation of the Renewable Energy Directive, because that directly gives an incentive to use sustainable aviation fuels wherever it's feasible, wherever it might be more efficient than using biofuels in the road sector. We only see that in very few countries at the moment. We, of course, need additional investment to support for those technologies that are not up to speed with HEFA at the moment. And that's also, I think, in agreement with what Joe said just a few minutes ago. We need to make sure that at some point they have the same chances of entering the market when we have market-based measures, and that basically means that we need to incentivize these upcoming new technologies that are more easily scalable in the beginning a bit more. Then we need clarity on the sustainability requirements, and that's also what Joe said, because it means that we have reliability for investment security. And also regarding the allocation of feedstocks, we need to make sure which feedstock should go into which transport mode or which sector. I think we have a lot of discussions at the moment where it's unclear, for example, how much of these used cooking oil we might be able to allocate to aviation in the long term, because of course there are other sectors that also might have a good use for them, and we need a clear roadmap on how to use these feedstocks that are very limited. Then, of course, we need additional research and development for those innovative SAF pathways. And then the last point, I think, is one that also refers a lot, or has a lot of connections to the first presentations that we saw today. It refers to the regulatory environment that helps the operators, meaning the airlines, to invest into sustainable aviation fuels. And I heard a lot of arguments about certain measures are too cheap, or that a higher cost should be related to aviation. And I think it's important to keep in mind that I think our joint target is not to make aviation more expensive, but to reduce aviation's emissions. And making it more expensive might be a side effect, it probably will be, but it should not be the primary argument. The primary argument might be that, for example, the COSIA certificates are not of high quality, but not that they are cheap. I think that's the wrong way to talk about this. But I think, or where I want to point is that any burden on the aviation industry should directly help to decarbonize the aviation industry, and the target should, as I said, not just be to increase cost. And this also refers to discussions about EU ETS and the energy taxation discussion. And also maybe one additional remark to the first presentation that we saw today. Putting a tax on something is not in order to increase the price usually, but to fund state expenses. And here the majority of the expenses related to aviation are covered by the operators. So again, I do see that aviation might or probably will become more expensive based on efforts to decarbonize, but it's not the primary target. Then my last slide, I try to keep this short. We, of course, hear a lot about SAF blending mandates, and we do hear about this in the Refuel EU initiative. And of course, a SAF blending mandate does exactly what I just asked for. It directly reduces emissions from the decarbonization sector. So it can be very effective if it is designed carefully. It should have a large geographical scope in order to avoid unwanted side effects, and such as tankering or rerouting, and also to maximize related volumes. If the whole EU has a blending mandate, it's much more volume than if just 2 or 3 individual countries have a blending mandate. It should consider a realistic ramp up that also reflects the speed with which new facilities can be set up, so that we know that only truly sustainable aviation fuels will be used to fulfill the mandate. And that in reality means something like 4 to 5 years lead time for a completely new facility on a green field. And of course, implementation and documentation should be very robust and easy. And so this might be also a few answers or opinions from my point of view on the questions that Joe just raised. For example, we clearly call for a book and claim approach to make it as simple as easy for the supplier to bring the fuel to the fuel farms. It should be on the supplier, because we think it's easier for them to ensure that they mix this into their fossil fuel stream. Otherwise, we would need a right to access fuel infrastructure, as we know from the power industry, which I think is a little bit more difficult for the fuel industry. And it should be on greenhouse gas reductions, because this is what we want to achieve. Again, we don't want to use sustainable aviation fuels. We want to reduce emissions from the aviation industry. And I think with that, I'm at the end of my presentation. Just a very brief remark on 3 publications that we were involved to more or less extent. And I think as you will see the slides later on, you can have a closer look and check if this might be interesting for you. Thank you.
Thanks for both of those presentations. It's good to see DHL, Deutsche Post putting such thought into what exactly a Refuel EU initiative will look like, what it needs to contain, and what the important next steps are for the process over the next 12 months. We've got a few questions coming in. I'll just ask one question to each Joe and Henrik. The same question to Joe and Henrik, just I think to cap this discussion. What is the most important decision European regulators can make in the next 12 months when it comes to fuel? If there is, one piece of advice or one thing you are to insist on, if you met the European Commission tomorrow, what's the one piece of advice? And I'll let Joe go first.
Oh, thanks very much. I think it goes back to my recommendation on my slide, which is think about everything at the same time. That if you're going to set a mandate or another scheme that's expressed in some slightly different way, that all of those factors that I talked about and Henrik talked about to do with, what the chain of custody approach is, what the metric is, what the feedstocks are, everything else has got to be considered at the same time. Because you can't fix one and then move the others. Because you've got to look at the package as a whole and say, does it work for the obligated supplier? Does it work for the society as a whole? Does it work for the advanced biofuels company or whichever fuel company? Is this a policy that they can take to the board or the investor and say, we want to do this now, we can scale up? So I think that's it's got to be well thought through.
Good. And Henrik, what's your one pitch?
Yes, so I could just say I agree with...
What's your one piece of advice you want to pitch?
Yes, do you hear me?
Yeah.
Do you hear me?
Yeah,
okay, perfect. Yes. Okay, sorry. So I could just say I agree with Joe, but I guess you would like me to say 2 or 3 more sentences. But I think it's very important that we get aligned policies, and we see so many discussions that are somehow interlinked but still work very individually, and not only between EU and member states but also within the EU itself. So I think it's very important that we have a move in the one direction that gives investment security. That means we have clear guidance on what is really considered sustainable, what is the roadmap in the long run, and of course provides the incentives while not unnecessarily binding funds of the people who need to pay for the SAF in the end.
Okay, thanks. Thank you for that. Okay, we have to wrap it up there, despite how interesting this topic is, and I'm sure we could keep discussing it for some time, because we're going to move on to the third part of our event today, which is the discussion on non-CO2 effects of aviation. Something which has been very underreported and underappreciated, but with a major report published last week, that's starting to change. I hand over now to Steve Arrowsmith. He's Chief of Environmental Protection at EASA, the European Aviation Safety Authority. But don't let the name fool you. EASA is about much more than safety. They also have a strong and growing role when it comes to the environmental impact of aviation, including work on fuels, this non-CO2 report, and producing a very useful environmental report every 3 years, which T&E in a small way contributes to. So I will hand over to Steve and let him take the floor to explain what exactly non-CO2 effects are and what may happen to address them. Steve, you're go.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll just bring up the presentation. Okay, good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to provide a brief presentation on this study that was performed by EASA on behalf of the Commission. And as Andrew said, it was published just last week. The objective of the study, as it says here in the title, was to do an updated analysis of the non-CO2 climate impacts of aviation and to look at potential policy measures to address this area. So a bit of background first. As you may be aware, there have been past analysis on this topic going back to 2006 and 2008. These primarily focused on NOx emissions, but coming out of those studies, the general conclusion was that scientific understanding was not considered to be mature enough to propose policies to address this area of non-CO2 impacts. And so moving on from that in 2012, the EU ETS regulated just CO2 emissions, which is directly correlated to fuel burn. So slightly easier to quantify compared to non-CO2 impacts, which often depend on the specific conditions within the engine combustor. Then in 2018, the Council and the Parliament requested the Commission to revisit this issue, and EASA was tasked with performing this analysis in response to the EU ETS Directive Article 34. The project team that we pulled together to look into these questions, they comprised of key European climate experts from DLR in Germany, MMU in UK, CICERO in Norway, C Delft in Netherlands, and CNRS in France. And they were supported by a stakeholder group that comprised of wider experts from within the atmospheric scientific community, technical experts, and policymakers. The terms of reference of the study were split into 3 tasks. The first one was to review and provide an updated status of science on this topic and the associated uncertainties linked to it with regard to the climate change effects of non-CO2 emissions. Task 2 then looked into what are the existing technological and operational options which are already in place and helping to limit or reduce non-CO2 impacts, and what are the potential trade-off issues linked to those. And then finally, task 3 went beyond that and started to look at potential additional policy action that could be brought forward, the pros and cons, and potential knowledge gaps that would need to be filled in order to implement those options. So looking at task 1 then, to begin with, the climate science. The analysis confirmed that the non-CO2 impacts, they arise from oxides of nitrogen, so NOx, soot particles, oxidized sulfur species, and water vapor. And in performing the analysis, it was clear that the scientific understanding with regard to the impacts of these emission species, they have evolved over the last decade. The largest impacts that can be calculated with what was called best estimates. These are linked to the net NOx effect and also contrail cirrus. But it's worth recognizing that there are still, despite the better understanding from a scientific perspective, still significant uncertainties with regard to the magnitude of these impacts. And finally, there was also a greater understanding with regard to some new effects in terms of soot particles and sulfur and aerosol cloud interactions. I'd like to spend just a bit of time on this slide because it contains, I think, some of the key messages that's embedded within the report. What you have here is a figure showing the effective radiative forcing, which is one climate metric that is used over a period of time between 2000 and 2018. And the effective radiative forcing metric, ERF, this provides a view of the current climate impact based on historic emissions. So it's a backward-looking metric. And as you can see in the top part of this figure, the net climate impact is seen to be increasing over time, as is the uncertainty bar associated with those impacts. These bar charts include both CO2 and the non-CO2 aspects. And within that, you can also see that the contrail cirrus part of these bar charts, that's considered to be an increasing part of the overall impact. But again, bear in mind that the uncertainty level associated with this specific impact makes up a large part of the overall uncertainty. You then have on the bottom part of this figure, focusing on specifically the NOx emissions. And this is a climate impact which is a composite of both positive, so warming effects, and negative cooling effects. And you can see in the bottom half here that the overall net effect is positive with regard to NOx. It's increased slightly over time, but so has the uncertainty aspects, the bars, the uncertainties. And that's something to also keep in mind as the scientific understanding evolves over time. The uncertainty doesn't always decrease as you identify additional secondary effects. Sometimes those bars can increase. And again, this is a key aspect that needs to be borne in mind when talking about non-CO2 impacts. With regard to the overall uncertainty associated with non-CO2 impacts, these contribute about 8 times more than CO2 to the overall uncertainty in these ERF forcing figures here. I'd like to just touch on, again, a different metric. The ERF, as I said, is a backward-looking historic metric. If we're looking forward in terms of the potential impacts of policy options, one metric that's often used is called the GWP 100, so global warming potential, looking at a time horizon of 100 years. And when looking at that and using that sort of metric and time horizon, this estimates that an overall CO2 multiplier, which is often quoted, that's approximately 1.7 in order to take into account both the CO2 and the non-CO2 impacts. But that's very much, this CO2 multiplier is very much dependent on the metric that you're using. We've seen multipliers quoted at 3, and I think that's linked to the GWP star metric. If you're using the GTP, the global temperature change potential metric, then the CO2 multiplier is 1.1. So these multipliers can depend on the metric and the time horizons that you're looking at. In terms of task 2 on current policies, these are very much focused on the ICAO certification standards at the global level. We have an aircraft engine emission standard that looks at both NOx and non-volatile particulate matter emissions, and also an aeroplane CO2 certification standard that's been put in place, became applicable this year, that reinforces the commercial pressure in designing an aircraft to make it fuel efficient, which generally provides a win-win situation in terms of reducing CO2 and non-CO2 emissions. And it's important to note that the certified data in terms of engine emissions, which is measured at the landing takeoff, so ground level, this is data that also feeds into modeling methodologies that's used to estimate the emissions in cruise and subsequently the climate impact. Finally, on task 3, we selected 6 policy options from a longer list to look at in detail. And these were grouped across 3 different types of measure: financial, fuel, and ATM. And I'll go into a bit more detail on each of these. So on the financial related measures, this looked at a possible NOx emissions charge and also the inclusion of NOx in the emissions trading scheme. Some of the key issues that came out of looking at these policy options of things that needed to be addressed. One was to reduce the scientific uncertainty on the climate impact from aircraft NOx emissions. And this includes not just, this includes both the emissions inventories in terms of how much NOx emissions is actually produced by aircraft, and then subsequently what is the climate impact of that. There's also a need to select an appropriate CO2 equivalent emissions metric, as we just touched on, lots of different metrics that could potentially be used and an associated time horizon. So what is the most appropriate to use in this context? And to agree on climate damage costs in order to determine the level of charge. In going through the discussions on this particular topic, there's clearly uncertainty with regard to the climate impact, and that was identified as a political risk in terms of the integrity of the EU ETS, recognizing that as science evolves, the intended effect of something that's put in place may change. And it was also considered possible to implement this through the CES performance and charging scheme. From a timescale perspective, this was considered to be a potential mid-long-term approach. Moving on to the fuel-related measures, this focused a lot on reduction of aromatics through 2 potential options, either through the fuel specifications or a SAF blending mandate. Some of the key issues, again, trying to reduce the scientific uncertainty in order to understand what exactly are the benefits that we're achieving from a reduction in aromatics, which reduces the amount of particulate matter, soot that's generated through burning the fuel, and therefore a reduction in persistent contrail cirrus formation. So a need to understand what are the benefits you're getting in order to consider it in terms of the regulatory impact assessment and the associated costs. It was also recognized that a facilitation initiative would be helpful to ensure the uptake of SAF within the aviation sector, and some way of monitoring exactly how well the policies are doing in terms of supporting the uptake of these fuels and the associated environmental benefits. At the moment, it's quite difficult to have that overview at a European level as to what exactly is going on in this area. It was recognized that the SAF approach is potentially a holistic approach, clearly resulting in reductions from a CO2 perspective, but within SAF, you typically have lower aromatics, so also leading to a reduction in soot particles and sulfur emissions, therefore leading to a reduction in persistent contrail cirrus. And in these sorts of policy options, this was considered to be something that could be put in place in the short to mid-term, again, recognizing that there's already discussions going on in this through the Refuel EU initiative. On ATM related measures, this looked at the possibility of trying to adjust flight trajectories to avoid what we call ice supersaturated areas, which are climate sensitive atmospheric areas that encourage the formation of persistent contrails and therefore cirrus, contrail cirrus clouds, and also a climate charge associated with the flight trajectory to try and ensure that it's climate optimized. Key issues, again, scientific uncertainty, trying to get a better handle as to what exactly is the benefit from optimizing these flight paths, and also understanding what the trade-offs are. If you're adjusting the flight paths to avoid contrast cirrus, you're burning more fuel, and so there's a CO2 trade-off there. It was recognized we needed to improve meteorological forecasts in order to better predict these persistent contrails, which we're trying to avoid. Again, selecting an appropriate metric and time horizon will be necessary, as would understanding the climate damage costs that will go into determining the level of charge. In terms of the implementation side of this, this certainly focused more on the flight's airspace over the Atlantic. Limited feasibility was thought within the congested European airspace to have the flexibility to optimize these flight paths. And communication will be essential in order to get buy-in from the relevant stakeholders, considering there'll be a trade-off in terms of fuel burn. Implementation would be through the CES performance and charging scheme, and timescale will be mid to long term. So in summary, some of the key messages, I think, is there's a need to continuously review the latest scientific understanding on non-CO2 impacts. This evolves over time as with research. To maintain and regularly update the ICAO environmental certification standards. So the existing policies, using them to incentivize the industry. The use of sustainable aviation fuels, certainly there's a potential win-win situation there to reduce CO2 and non-CO2 emissions, leading to a no-regret policy. And clearly further research areas that could be taken forward through Horizon Europe that need to be addressed if some of these policy options are to be implemented in the future and lead to the benefits that we want to achieve. And these research areas cover the science, the metrics that we look at, accurate emission inventories, and a better understanding as to exactly what the environmental impact is based on those emission inventories. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. Thanks, Andrew.
Sorry, slight Zoom difficulty after all these months. Thanks, Steve, for that excellent presentation. And I have to say, I think it's really an excellent report. I think there's a lot of praise to be given to the scientists who over the last 10 years have helped advance knowledge in this area. It's not the best funded area, so it wasn't the easiest task for them, but they have a lot of work into it. And I think EASA and all the other partners who were involved in this report in particular. I think two things for me stand out when reading it. The first is it's for a report on the non-CO2 effects of aviation. It's actually quite accessible and easy to understand. So kudos on taking something as complicated as that. And then secondly, I think there was a lot of foresight in not just looking at the science and saying, well, look, this is the problem, but also looking at some of the potential solutions. I think, a report that just says a non-CO2 is a huge problem, I think it's good that you ended the report on a positive note, which said, yes, it's a huge problem, but look how many options there are to address it. And I think that should give a bit of hope and encouragement to everyone involved in this area. One question for you. I know EASA has a big international footprint and has different offices and obviously works with counterparts across the world. Do you see in this report and any of the next steps, do you see any potential areas for cooperation with other parts of the world? And for example, on this transatlantic rerouting, I guess that's something which you'd need to cooperate with the FAA in the US and probably Canadian authorities. Has any discussions along those lines taken place, or is that something you can discuss?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Andrew. It's certainly something that's being looked into in terms of cooperation with partners with regard to these sorts of adjustments to the flight trajectories. And I think, we have the necessary working relationships in place to take forward those discussions on implementation, so that can certainly be looked into, and I think there's already some discussions going on. But I think it's important to note that in order to ensure that when we put in place these pilot projects and ultimately implement something like this, that we really are achieving what we hope we would achieve. And there's some fundamental research that needs to be looked at beforehand in order to frame that discussion on implementation. As I mentioned, a need to improve the meteorological modeling aspects such that we understand under what conditions these persistent contrails are formed, and then we understand exactly what are the sort of meteorological conditions, sensitive climate, atmospheric areas that we need to avoid in order to then try and implement that. And associated with that, there's a need to carefully consider the associated trade-offs. So if you're looking to adjust the flight trajectories to mitigate the overall climate impact, and that ends up burning more fuel, is the overall benefit that we're getting from that implementation really leading to a reduced climate impact?
Okay, great. And on the question of fuels, because this report looks at the ability of sustainable aviation fuels to reduce the non-CO2 effects, is there much scientific knowledge or understanding of the different impacts that different types of fuels can have, alternative fuels can have, biofuels versus advanced versus e-fuels? Or is that an area where more research is needed? Because, you know, next year, Refuel EU, one of the big steps for the EU will be to decide, you know, which fuels they want to support. Do we know much about which are the best fuels to support for this?
Well, certainly, in terms of CO2 reductions, there's various methodologies out there to ensure that when these fuels are brought forward for approval, because they clearly have to be certified as safe to use within the existing global fleet, that at the same time you assess the sustainability of these fuels, and there's methodologies out there to actually quantify the emission reductions you'd expect to get from using these fuels to give credit to the operators using them. So certainly that's clearly mapped out. In terms of the non-CO2 emissions, in general, what we've seen from the sustainable aviation fuels that have been produced so far, there is a reduction in the aromatics content that obviously would vary depending on the type of fuel, and it's that reduction in aromatic content that gives some additional benefit from a non-CO2 perspective through a reduction in particulate matter and subsequent contrail cirrus formation. And some of the certification data that we're gathering in terms of the particulate matter standard, that helps us give some idea as to the characteristics of the engine and the combustor and how it performs from that perspective.
Okay, that's interesting. So every time a new fuel is sent for certification, it's put into engines, and you know data is being gathered as to what the PM impact is of those different fuels.
No, I was referring to the actual certification standards. So when an engine is certified, it has to meet a certain particulate matter standard from a technology design perspective. But through that data, you can get some indication as to how the engine performs with regard to the particulate matter emissions, and then subsequently how that would benefit from the operational aspects.
Okay, fascinating. Okay, great. Thanks for that clarification. We'll have to wrap up non-CO2 and the event overall now. We're up against time. We will circulate the non-CO2 report along with the rest of the presentations. And as I said, it is very readable and has some good proposals for how to proceed. So just a few concluding remarks on behalf of TINI and behalf of the other organizers. Firstly, I'd like to thank all the speakers for attending today and for all the participants for following through these different topics. And I'd like to thank our colleagues at Carbon Market Watch for co-organizing with us. And a special thank you for the speakers who were answering questions in the chat function during this event, so keeping the discussion going online there. I think for me, there was 3 takeaways from this event. Firstly, it's still all to play for how the aviation sector will emerge from the crisis. We're getting a little clearer understanding of how the medical situation will evolve in the coming months, but we don't know, what the next steps that will be taken by customers, how industry will react in this post-COVID world, what the regulators are doing, and how they will react to a slow return of travel, especially in some key sectors. What's good is that we do know some industry partners quite forward-looking in how they are behaving now in terms of regulation, and they're determined that we don't just address the COVID crisis, but that we also address the climate crisis as well. And that's fantastic to see. I think in today's discussion, we had a whole range of policy issues being discussed: pricing, fuel mandates, industrial support, non-CO2. I think that really reinforces there's a lot we should and can be doing to reduce the climate impact of aviation. And from our perspective, we'd argue that we haven't really been doing it for the last few decades, and the aviation sector has a lot of catching up to do with other sectors who are beginning a much more rapid decarbonisation pathway. I think a final takeaway from us is there's a lot which can happen at European level. We've had a lot of discussion today about international level and about the shortcomings in CORSIA. And we know as well there is so much the EU can be doing to regulate aviation emissions, be it better pricing, be it some of these non-CO2 measures, be it in fuel mandates which are introduced at EU level. And I think considering how urgent the situation is to reduce aviation emissions, it seems to us that what we should be doing is reaching for those EU level solutions, and hoping that other blocks, other parts of the world can follow us. The EU set a net zero target recently, and now others are following, like China, Japan, South Korea. And we'd hope that if the EU can lead on mitigating aviation's climate impact, other markets can follow suit. We hope some of these ideas are reflected in the European Commission's upcoming Smart and Sustainable Mobility Strategy, which we understand will be published next week. In particular, we'll be looking at whether some of these non-CO2 ideas will be included. We now understand they are the majority of aviation's climate impact. We hope that the SSMS can be as smart as it claims to be and sustainable as it claims to be, and start really bedding in some of these non-CO2 mitigation measures within the European policy framework. And that strategy will be out next week, and TNE will have its own reaction to it when it's published. So I will leave it at that. I hope you all have a pleasant rest of the day, rest of the week. We will circulate the presentations and some reading material in due course. So with that, I say thank you and goodbye.